Thanks, Chris, for the introductions, and thanks to everyone for being here. So indeed, I will speak about the role of grain-scale properties on fold deformation, but both from an insight from a laboratory experiment and numerical experiment. And indeed, I think there is a bigger part about laboratory experiment today than numerical in the end. So let's start with what is a fold. So a fold is a zone of weakness with damages and fractures in between two host rock. You can move rapidly, some meter per second, slowly some centimeter per year, and generate seismic or aseismic motion. So you can observe a gradient of damage increasing toward the center of the fault, which is the fault core, where all the previous slips progressively create wear particles that can be called fault gouge. So this fault core is also very important because it is the place where the energy really will be released during coseismic slip, and also the place where strain can be accommodated. So how the fault can be accommodated? It can be distributed, so we can observe strain, distributed strain within the fault. So you can observe it at a large scale here within the Carboneras fault in Spain. So this is at the large scale, some meters long, where we see all this deformation happening. But if we zoom in on at a smaller scale within this fault, we can still observe these distributed deformations. So that mainly are produced by grain alignment, and in this case here at a small scale would be from the size of the grain. So in this talk today, I will not focus too much on. You will see some distributed deformation, but I will mostly focus on another type of strain deformation that are localized deformation. So indeed, strain can be also localized within the fault. So here you have two examples at a large scale, let's say. One from a Monte Maggio fault in Italy, and another one for a Corona Heights in the US. So you see the direction of deformation respect to the direction of shearing. And again, if here we zoom in on at a smaller scale, we can observe an important grain size reduction and a principal slip zone where we have the localization of the slips within the fault deformation. Here, the deformation are way much larger than the size of the grain and are usually called shear deformations. So these shear deformations can be very complex. So here you have what we call a riddle shear structures with a different orientation of riddle bands, conjugate riddles from a quartz-rich sandstone. But for the rest of the presentation, I will use, let's say, a simplified view on this shear localization. So I will mostly speak about riddle shear bands. So what you see here in green that are oriented from 10-15 degrees from the direction of shearing most of the time. And boundary shear bands that are the red one here that are parallel to the direction of shearing and at the interface between the fault gouge and the rock walls. So here indeed is a simplified view since we can have many other shear bands happening. So all the pictures I showed you from the field are from one instant of the fault. And sometimes it's difficult to really understand when they form, how they evolve with fault displacement. And in order to better understand how these shear bands evolve, we can use laboratory experiments since they are able to reproduce this shear deformation at a smaller scale. So within laboratory experiments, one of the experiments we can use is direct shear experiment, can be single direct shear, double direct shear, where basically we have a fault gouge layer with synthetic powders that is sandwiched between two metal blocks or two rocks, first compacted, and then we apply shearing to this experiment to deform this fault gouge layer. So within this type of experiments, we are able to follow the evolution of shear stress as a function of fault displacement. So here are some data from Bedford and Faulkner about the quartz fault gouge, where they observe an increase in shear stress toward the maximum value, then steady state sliding, and then they were also able to observe unstable sliding within this particular experiment. And these unstable slidings are kind of what we call laboratory seismic cycles, which are an alternance of stick phases where the fault is locked and the energy is stored within the medium, and slip phases where the energy is released and the fault is able to move. So now, if we want to understand how this shear deformation happens, we can do multiple experiments. So here they did 3, for example, and retrieve the microstructure at the end of each experiment. I'll observe these microstructures at the SEM microscope. So here, what we can observe is that at stop 1, we have multiple riddle bands oriented at the same angle from the direction of shearing. Then when we reach stop 2, so just before these instabilities, all the riddle bands collapse into one main riddles, and we have an incipient boundary shear here at the top boundary. And at the end of this experiment, which is also in between the slip instabilities, we don't see anymore the riddle bands, but we have 2 well-established boundary shear bands at the top and bottom boundaries. And why these shear bands are important? Because the onset of these instabilities requires shear localization. So that's why we want to understand how they form, why they form, and how they evolve. This shear localization are also coming from an interplay between many variables and parameters around the faults. The initial porosity that is within the fault that can change the degree of localization, the applied normal stress shearing velocity, the temperature that is within the fault, the amount of strain, as I showed just before, that the fault can reach, but also the pore fluid pressure that can be within the fault. So today I will not focus on these outside the parameters, but I would like to ask the question, what makes fault deformation distributed or localized? So here I put again the 2 images that I showed you first, the one with distributed deformation and one with localized deformation. And in order to understand a bit better how these 2 different types of deformation can form, we can go to the grain scale or the micro scale. So here you have the well-known Byerlee friction laws that said that friction was mostly in between 0.6 and 0.8 and independent of this normal stress. And here is the more recent study from Colettini et al., where they gave us many experiments, laboratory experiments, but coming from rocks from the field, where they found also different friction values and much lower friction values. And indeed, what we know is that this very high friction corresponds to strong minerals. So for example, quartz particles that are mainly granulars, while this lower friction coefficients mostly correspond to phyllosilicate, as for example, muscovites, which are weak minerals and can be many types of different weak minerals that are mostly platy minerals. And these strong minerals will tend to produce an important grain size reduction and mostly localized deformations, while these weak minerals will tend to produce more distributed deformation. So from this, we know that the type of mineral impact mechanical data as friction, and will also intend to produce a different type of distributed or localized deformation. So the main question of my talk today will be how grain scale properties act on the mechanics of shear deformation and fault behavior. And to do so, I will first present you some laboratory experiments that I did during my postdoc here in Rome. First case study will be about the role of grain sizes within the strong mineral contents, where we will be mostly focusing on localized deformations. And the second case study where I will present you the impact of weak mineral content within a strong minerals granular gouge, where we will tend toward distributed deformation, even if I will not focus on this. And in the second part, I will go to the numerical experiments. First question, can we reproduce this laboratory experiment with the same physics? And second question, how the different zone of the fault gouge evolve and participate to shear deformations. So first, let's go to the laboratory scale. I just want to say that the mechanical data that I will present today are not new. But the new part of these two studies is the understanding of shear deformation through acoustic emissions. So I will mainly speak about acoustic emission happening during these shear deformations. So for this experiment, I use a double direct shear experiment with the machine Bravado that is in the Sapienza here in Rome. So this is the type of experiment sample that we use. So we have two synthetic full gauge layers here and here, parallel together, that are sandwiched between two forcing blocks and the central block. So we insert this sample into the biaxial machine here. First, we will apply normal stress here of 52 MPa. And once the sample is compacted enough, then we will shear our sample with this vertical piston here at a constant velocity of 10 to 100 microns per second. And as I said, the kind of new part here is the acoustic emission setup we use. So we have piezoelectric sensors that are glued to the two sides of the forcing blocks. And we record continuously the acoustic emission that are happening during fault shearing. So once we have our acoustic measurements, so here you see we capture mainly the amplitude of the acoustics during the entire fault displacement. And then we will use STA, LTA, and FL, so short-term average, long-term average, in order to pick the start, the end, and the amplitude of each acoustics within the amplitude data, and create a catalog of acoustic emission for each of our experiments. And then, thanks to this catalog, so here you see in gray all the different acoustics that can happen during one experiment, we can compute, for example, the acoustic emission rate, which is the number of acoustic emission per second, and which is here in red. Okay, so first case study, what is the impact of grain sizes within strong minerals? So for this case study, which is homogeneous quartz mixtures, and I changed the size of the grains from 125 microns to 10 microns grain size, and in between biodispersed mixtures of both grain sizes, 25, 50, 75% of the small particles. So here you can observe the mechanical data of this first study. So the friction and compaction rate as a function of the fault displacement. So first thing we can see is that indeed it's the strong minerals. So all the steady state friction are in between 0.6, 0.64. And yeah, so all these experiments are the same steady state friction, but they have a different way of reaching the steady state friction, from strain hardening for initial coarse particle to strain weakening for initial small particles. Then if we have a look at the compaction rates, we can see that this is mostly the same for all the experiments, except for the one with initial coarse particles, where we have most important compaction, and the maximum compaction rate corresponds to the end of yielding of our experiments. Now, if we zoom in on the end of this friction experiment, what we can observe is that we have one case where we observe this laboratory seismic cycle that I was speaking about before. And this is the case with initial small particles. Here is the microstructure of the initial small and initial coarse particles. So here you have the bigger view, where we can observe indeed boundary shear bands here at the interface, some of the riddles, and again here it's more difficult to see it, but we have also the boundary shears here at the two interfaces. Indeed, if we zoom in on at a smaller scale, we see a bit better the shear bands and the grain size, the important grain size reduction. And if we zoom in on again, here we clearly see the slip localization within the grain size reduction, so forming this boundary shear zone. So what we can see is that indeed, again, in our experiment, we have this boundary shear zone with slip localization, but we can still observe that we have a very different central deformation zone, since here we had very small initial particles, and here we had bigger particles, but that seemed to have lived important fragmentation. And these two different microstructures could impact impact the first history of the sliding friction, and could impact also or have a role in the slip instabilities we observe at the end of some experiments. Now let's go to the acoustic emission rates. So here you have the evolution of acoustic emission rate as a function of the fault displacement for the 5 mixtures. First thing we can see is that the number of acoustic emission per second increases with the average grain size. So you can see here. So the dark blue is the one with initial coarse particles. And the second thing we can see is that this acoustic emission rate is strain dependent. So it has the same evolution. First, an important increase of acoustic emission at the start of the experiment, then nonlinear decrease toward steady state when the experiment reaches the steady state porosity. Again, the experiment with initial small particles is a bit different than the rest of the experiment, since we observed this laboratory 6 mixed cycles. So at the start of the experiment, we couldn't detect much acoustics, but when the instability started, then we have a very different pattern. Then if I plot the compaction rate I showed you before as a function of this acoustic emission rate, we can see that the maximum compaction rate corresponds to the place where we have the maximum acoustic emission rate. And this is maximum for the initial coarse particles. That it means that indeed we have an important fragmentation happening here by increasing the initial grain size. Now we could go a bit further within this acoustic emission amplitude by divided the amplitude in 3 categories: low, medium, and high amplitude acoustic emissions. And here you see the cumulative number of acoustic emissions as a function of the fault displacement for 3 different mixtures: initial coarse, 50-50 mixtures, and the initial small. And what we can see is that not only the acoustic emission rate is a function of the initial grain size, but also the amplitude of acoustic emission. So here, for our initial coarse particles, we have a higher number of medium and high amplitudes than the mixtures and obviously the small particles. And this is true at the beginning of the experiment, but also at the end of the experiment. So the amplitude of acoustic emission increases with the average grain size. Then we can go further into the analysis of this amplitude. So here is the same plots of the cumulative number of acoustics. And here is the zoom in on the 2 first millimeter of these 2 experiments, where we can see a progressive evolution from low, medium, and high amplitude acoustics. And it's always the same evolution. So we will not have high amplitude before the low amplitude acoustics. And indeed, what we know is that at start of the experiment, so in order that the grains can move, so we have some friction and grain rearrangements that can correspond to this low amplitude acoustic emission that were already found to be a signature from microslips or grain rearrangements. Then maybe the grain starts soon to move, so we have some chippings, a bit of fragmentation happening while we have this medium. So we could say that this medium maybe are characteristics of chipping mechanisms. And finally, we have an increase of fragmentation, and maybe we have bigger fragmentation. In the case of initial small particles, here we have very high amplitude of acoustic emission that in this case correspond to stress drop. So we have mainly maybe 4 chains breaking. So obviously all these mechanisms then happen together. So it's not one at a time. And so it's difficult to isolate everything, but all these different amplitudes can correspond to different micromechanical properties and tell us about gauge friction evolution. So take home message number 1. So I presented you a full gauge experiment with different initial grain sizes that appear to have the same steady state friction. But what we saw is that acoustic emission rates and acoustic emission amplitude decreases first with strain and also decreases with the smaller initial grain size. So you can see the very different pattern that you observe here. We also confirmed that the fine grain size favors slip instabilities, as we know from the literature, and they also present indeed a very different acoustic emission evolution. So we can clearly distinguish stable experiment from an unstable just by looking this acoustic emission pattern. And finally, the acoustic emission amplitude observed during shearing can correspond to different micromechanisms that are useful to understand where we are in the fault shearing. So from now, I presented you homogeneous mineralogy with pure quartz and localized deformation. But what about heterogeneous mineralogy? So for example, if we mix a strong mineral with a weaker mineral, that can be the muscovite I presented you in the introduction. So is there still grain fragmentation? What is controlling acoustic emission in this case? So we will now go to the second case study, where I studied with Giuseppe Volpe the impact of weak mineral content within a strong mineralogy. So here I still have 5 different homogeneous mixtures, from initial quartz particles to pure muscovite mixture, and in between bidispersed mixtures of both type of mineralogy, again 25, 50, 75%. In this study, we use 2 different quartz grain size, but I will mainly focus on the bigger grain size here, just to not put too many data on the slides. And here, so I will show it before, so is the 50-50 mixture of this quartz muscovite, which is, I think, a very nice picture. I mean, I like this type of microstructures. What do we already know from this type of mixtures? So there were many studies that already studied this type of mixture from a mechanical point of view. And here is the picture of recent work of Giuseppe Volpe from 2022. Indeed, we know that by increasing the weak mineral or muscovite content, we go from localized deformation towards more distributed deformations. And we also have a decrease in frictional strength. So as I showed you in the Byerly plots, where we have friction decreasing towards 0.3, more or less. And in between, for the bidispersed mixtures, we have kind of a mixed mode, mixing a bit of cataclasis, a bit of distributed deformation, and again, also frictional strength in between. So indeed, from a mechanical point of view, this is what we have for our data. So here you have the evolution of friction as a function of the fault displacement, and here friction as a function of the percentage of weak minerals, so muscovite here. And you see that we have a decrease of the friction with the increase in muscovite content, which is consistent also with a recent study with this type of mixtures. Now, if we go to look at the compaction rate, as I showed you before, so we see that the one for pure quartz particles, so strong minerals, is very high. So we have probably an important fragmentation happening here. And once we increase the muscovite content, we decrease a lot. This compaction rate means that probably there is not so many compaction happening here for these weak minerals. So compaction rate decreases with muscovite content. Now, what about our microstructure first? So indeed, as we know, we go from cataclastic processes, localized deformation for our strong minerals, and the more we increase the percentage of weak muscovite minerals, the more we go toward distributed deformations. So here, within localized deformation, we can see the important fragmentation that is happening within these quartz minerals. Now, if we go toward the 50-50 mixture, I think it's still interesting because indeed, as we can see, the platy muscovite minerals completely surrounded the quartz grains, and they isolate them from each other. So even if the shape is a bit weird, so maybe they experience a bit of fragmentation indeed, but at a certain point, they are completely isolated from each other. So probably that's why we have also less fragmentation at this stage. And at the end, so the pure muscovite experiments, we see that most of the grains are oriented within the direction of shearing. And we have also this kinking appearing, which is consistent with muscovite type experiment and reflect the stress evolution within this sample. So friction is controlled by the amount of silicate as well as the fabric or shear development during shear deformations. Now, what about the acoustic emission we have within our experiments? So this is the acoustic emission rate as a function of the fault displacement. First thing we can see is that, again, as for the strong mineral content, acoustic emission rate is strain dependent. So we have this first increase of acoustic emission at the start of shearing, reaching the maximum value, and then non-linearly decreasing toward the steady state of porosity. Now, what we can see is that the more we increase the muscovite content, the more we decrease the acoustic emission rates towards almost zero. I mean, we have one acoustic emission every, I don't know, not a lot. And is very gradual. So it's really something that is happening also within the smaller grain size of quartz. If we have a look at the average amplitude during fall slip, we have the same thing happening. So the more we increase the muscovite content, the more we decrease the amplitude of acoustic emission that are observed within fall shearing. So what we can see from this is that the cataclysmic processes, so fully localized deformation with a lot of fragmentation, so pure strong minerals, we have a very important number of acoustic emission. While once we have fully distributed processes with these weak minerals, we have almost no acoustics. So that's why we said muscovite silences fall gouge deformation. So for this second study, I will almost stop here. So take home message number 2. We showed that the strong quartz minerals have a very high friction coefficient. They show very localized deformation with an important fragmentation, cataclysmic processes with micro slips, boundary shear band formation, etc. And we also have a very high amount of acoustic emission rates that correspond to also high amplitude acoustic emissions. If we start to mix it with weak mineral content, we decrease obviously the friction that we observe, since the friction will be mostly controlled by the muscovites. And we also decrease a lot the acoustic emission rate, or the number of acoustic emission, since the muscovite particles isolate all the grains from each other, preventing probably some fragmentation we observe. So we have a lower acoustic emission rate, lower amplitude of acoustic emission. And once we go towards pure muscovite content, we decrease the friction towards 0.35 and have almost no acoustic emission happening, since we have only reorientation of the grains within the direction of shearing. So we have completely distributed deformation. And the few acoustics that happens maybe are due to, I don't know, some breakage of these minerals or micro slips that we observe. It can be also that the instrumentation that we use is not able to measure lower acoustic that could happen maybe in this case. Now, fault can also be more complex in nature, because this is a Makimin melange from a paper from Fagereng and Bill. And we see here that they have a classed strong mineral that is in between two layers of weaker minerals. And there are many examples from this type of things in nature that show that maybe it's not a homogeneous mixture. Maybe there is a layer of some strong mineral, then layer of weaker mineral, etc. So with Giuseppe Volpe, we tried another experiment, still in the same context, where we didn't mix properly the two minerals, but we did layering experiments. So alterning a muscovite layer, a quartz layer, and another muscovite layer. So weak, strong, weak mineral. And this is the microstructure we have at the end of the experiment here. So you see here the very small muscovite mineral that is remaining after shearing. And here the big quartz part that is remaining. So first thing that we see, if we plot the friction, so this is the friction of this experiment, this is the friction we observed before, and we have a friction of this type of experiment that corresponds to the pure muscovite case. So indeed, friction is totally controlled by this small layer of muscovite here and here at the interface. But as we can see here, we seem to have a lot of fragmentation. We have also reader shear, so we have slip localized here, but some cataclysmic and shear processes still happening in between. So you have kind of double mechanisms. Now, if we look at the acoustics in this case, so these are the acoustic emission rate as a function of fault displacement for the previous experiment, the pure quartz, the pure muscovite, and the homogeneous mixtures. Now, if we have a look at the new acoustic emission rate, it seems very close to the one of pure quartz. Indeed, here we have a very large amount of quartz particles, but it means that there is really something happening within this entire experiment that is similar to the pure localized deformation that are happening within the quartz. So we have this double mechanism that is interesting to study. And if you want to know more about this experiment, I ask you to go to the talk of Giuseppe Volpe that he will give at AGU this year. So to conclude about this first laboratory scale case study, we saw that mineralogy, deformation mechanisms, friction, and acoustic emission are strongly linked together. So I presented you the impact of the grain size and that decreasing the initial grain size within strong minerals, we decrease a lot the number of acoustic emission we have. So acoustic emission is strain dependent, but grain size dependent. And we also saw that acoustic emission is dependent also on the weak mineral contents and decrease a lot with this weak mineral contents. So passive acoustic emission can provide a unique insight into deformation mechanism because indeed with acoustic emission, we can know the strain, the amount of strain that the fault kind of experienced, the type of fragment, the importance of fragmentation we have within this fault, and the type of mechanism, localized best distributed deformation, we can have within the fault. And again, also the type of mineral, we can also guess with the amount of acoustics we can observe within sheared fault. And to finish, heterogeneities, as you saw, make the story more complex, and we will dig a bit more on this with Giuseppe. Now let's go a bit at the micro scale. So here you see 3 different microstructures that I presented you before with different grain size, different type of minerals. But indeed, all this, I call it large scale deformation, but for me it's large scale, but it's not so large, are due to the micro scale contacts that are happening in between the grains together. So I propose now to go to the discrete element modeling in order to zoom in on this contact and see how we can understand more things about what's happening here. So first, can we reproduce this type of deformation with discrete elements and how these different fault zones evolve and participate to shear deformation?
Nathalie.
Yes.
Sorry, this is Massimo. Can you tell me, in all the previous experiment, which is the range of sliding velocities that you are considering?
So the sliding velocities is, for the first case experiment was 100 micron per second. And the second case, 10 micron per second.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So discrete elements modeling, for the one that don't know the method, are designed for granular material. So each particle that we will insert within the model will behave as a signal body with their proper dynamic, their proper velocity, displacement, rotation, everything. And they are based on Newtonian dynamics. So indeed, to deal with contact interaction between grains, we will put interparticle friction, the particle stiffness, and damping to really control the physical contacts of these grains. And what is interesting about this type of models is that we can modify almost every grain properties, the shape, the size, as I said, the friction that can represent the mineralogy, and many other parameters, just the time of computation that will change. So this is the type of shearing experiments that we use. So we will insert normal stress here at the the top boundary, shearing velocity, so it's still a direct shear experiment. The bottom wall is fixed, and then we have periodic boundary condition in order to maintain the continuity of slips. So everything that is happening here, we will find it here at a certain time of the simulation. And I'm using the code Melody 2D that was implemented by Guillemot. So mostly I will speak about localized deformation within this microscale zoom. And I will go directly to the next slide. So again, with numerical modeling, we can follow the evolution of friction as a function of fold displacement. So here you have, in this case, this experiment, an increase in friction, then decrease toward a steady state friction. And what was nice within this model is that we were able to follow the evolution of this shear deformation with a fold shearing. So I put you the video. And we will see, as I showed you within the introduction, that first we have many Riedel bands that are formed, so before the friction peak. Then they will progressively collapse into two main Riedel bands once we decrease friction. And during this slip weakening phase, we have progressive formation of the boundary shear at the top here until complete boundary shear bands at the top boundary and bottom boundary in this group. So we have kind of a very similar evolution of what I presented you in the introduction. Now, since we use numerical modeling, we are able to modify the properties of the grains. So my objective in this paper was to see what is the influence of the grain scale properties on fold deformation. So the result I showed you in the previous slide, I used the interparticle friction of 0.3, but now I can modify this interparticle friction using a very low or very high interparticle friction that can correspond to a different type of mineral or a different roughness that we implement between these grains. So in terms of macro scale friction, mostly if we increase interparticle friction, we will increase this friction peak that we see at the beginning and slightly increase the steady state friction, but not a lot. We will still be around 0.442, 43. Now, if we have a look at the shear deformation that we have, here we see also a big difference. So if we have a very low interparticle friction, we see that you have this strange Riedel structure. So we will not have only this Riedel, but we have these conjugate Riedels also appearing. And we also decrease the angle orientation from the Riedel bands with respect to the direction of shearing. And once we increase this antiparticle friction, we don't have anymore this Riedel structure, but we have a higher angle from direction of shearing and a higher number of Riedels within the sample. So indeed, this shear localization evolve with interparticle friction, but they also evolve depending on the number of grains we have within the thickness. So we tried also to increase the number of particles within the fold gouge and see that for a very low number, we have still this strange Riedel structure, while when we have a very high number of particles, we don't see anymore the Riedel and we have a very high angle orientation from the direction of shearing. Then if we change also the shear modulus, again, we change the properties of the shear deformations going toward this structure, Riedel structure by increasing the shear modulus.
Nathalie, sorry,
Yes.
can I ask you another clarification? This is Massimo. So in your model, numerical model, the slip is measured at the boundary of the two sliding surface.
Yes.
Shear stress is measured there, but also the normal stress is measured at that point?
Yeah.
Okay, so and can you model how it evolves?
You mean the shear stress?
The normal stress, the normal stress.
The normal stress is constant because we impose the normal stress here.
Okay, thanks.
So, yeah, so basically, grain scale characteristics, as you saw, can completely change the Riedel structure formation, the orientation of these Riedel bands, and also the friction peak that we have in the model. Now, if I compare the two microstructures I have, so the one I showed you within the laboratory, and the one that I just showed you now with discrete elements. So both are have a very low initial porosity, homogeneous material, small grain size. And we see that in both cases, we have riddle bands. And well, here we don't see it, but there is a boundary shear here at the top and bottom boundary. But if we look into details within these shear bands, in one case, within the laboratory, we have important fragmentation, compaction mechanisms here within the bands, while in numerical modeling, here there was no fragmentation allowed. So if we zoom in on these bands, we see that we have a decrease in solid fraction. So we have a dilation happening here. So at a large scale, we see the same phenomenon, but coming from different physical processes. So if we want to really compare these models to what is observed in the laboratory, at least for this strong minerals with a lot of fragmentation, we need to insert fragmentation within these models. So lead me to my second part of microscale modeling. So we produced a second model, smaller this time, looking like this. So small part of the fault from the laboratory. So we still have the bottom wall that is fixed, top wall that is submitted to normal stress and the shear stress velocity, and our boundary conditions. But this time we added fragmentation within these models. So basically, all the big grains that you see here are first discretized into a certain amount of subgrains that are initially glued together. And once the effort applied on one big grain will be higher than the initial cohesion, the subgrains will be progressively able to break and represent the grain fragmentation that we have. Then the rest, all the contacts are following the standard discrete element vein contacts, so the same as the first model. Here I did 3 different numerical modeling, one with initial coarse particles, are about 200 micron grain size, one about a small initial grain size, and the bidispersed mixtures of both grain sizes. So here are the friction data as a function of flow displacement. So you will see the 2 from the laboratory I showed you before, the 2 smooth curved, and the one from numerical modeling that are a bit more noisy that are here. So what we see is that for the 2 first millimeters, we have a very good agreement for the friction. But when we will shear more our numerical fault, we will still have an offset coming from the 2D of the numerical modeling, the 3D of our laboratory experiments. And we know that without this third dimension, we will always have a lower friction coefficient. Now, can we really reproduce the boundary shears that we had in laboratory experiments? So here I will show you a small video of bidispersed mixtures. Here you have the grain damage, which is the amount of fragmentation within the model. So basically the black color is no fragmentation. And when it will become yellow, it will represent a fragmentation of the grain. And the yellow grain will be mostly the subgrains that are totally detached and behaving as a single grain. Here you will see the fortune evolution. And then there is a zoom within these parts where we expect to have some shear localization, since it's what we had in the laboratory experiments. And then to finish here, the solid fractions. So basically blue are voids and the red are solids. So we will be able to see how the porosity evolved within these parts. So I show you a video that is a bit fast, but I will put it again. So we see a lot of fragmentation happening within the entire sample. And indeed, at a certain point, we clearly have most important fragmentation here at the top boundary. So if I put again the video, what we can see is that first the entire gouge is moving towards the right. And at a certain point, it stops here. This part is not moving, and we localize the slip indeed within the boundary shear zone here. We see that most of the fortunes are oriented at 45 degrees, which is consistent with this type of granular models. But in the boundary shear bands, we have a more homogeneous fortunes evolution here. We also see that we reduced a lot the porosity since the beginning. So we have this reduction of porosity and compaction that we couldn't have in the first model. So indeed, yes, with this fragmentation model, we are able to reproduce quantitatively what we have in the laboratory. Now, the idea was to, as I said in the question at the start, to see the importance of the different part of the fault gouge in the shear deformations. So I divided the fault into 4 different zones: the teeth, the boundary shear at the top, the central deformation zone, and the boundary shear at the bottom, and see the amount of damage or fragmentation that each zone leaves. So I will first describe the mixture since you saw the video. So this was the microstructure, numerical microstructure at the end of the fault shearing. So what we can see is that indeed the most important damage is observed within the shear, the bottom shear, which is consistent with what we see here. Then we have a smaller amount of damage within the teeth and within the bottom shear zone. And still an important damage within the central deformation zone, where we see important fragmentation, even if we have still big grains that we can distinguish here. What we can also see is that most of the fragmentation is happening within the first parts, the first millimeter of shearing. So after this millimeter, part of the gouge is stabilizing. So as you saw in the video, this part first is a lot fragmented, and then we have a constant evolution of damage and everything is stopped. But the damage within the boundary shear at the top is still increasing. So it means that we have still fragmentation happening here. Now, if we go to the initial small particles, we have a very different microstructure in the end. And it appears that here, even if we have the same amount of damage, so within the bottom part and within the teeth, we have something different happening since we have localization that is mostly at the center here. But as we see, this localization appears later in the simulation, since at start we had the same amount of damage within the top boundary and within the central deformation zone. So it means that maybe grain alignment or something made it localize here and not at the top boundary. But again, most of the fragmentation and damage is happening within the first millimeter. Now, if we go to initial coarse particle, we have again something different. Mostly an important damage within the entire fold, since we know that larger grain size should produce more fragmentation. But we also see that the fragmentation is not stabilized within the 2 first millimeters in comparison to the two over mixtures. And we have a damage that is the same mostly within all the different zones. So even if here we seem to have something localized, here we have an important damage too. But at a certain point, we see that we will localize again within the top boundary shear zone.
Nathalie,
Yep.
sorry. It looks like the relative size of the zones is changing from coarse to mixture to small. Is that true, that the central deformation zone is bigger and the other in the coarse and small?
So yeah, in the mixture is a bit smaller because the initial sample was a bit smaller, so it was not exactly the same thickness for this one. But these two are almost the same. It's just that then maybe there is not the same exact amount of fragmentation, so it's less compacted, the initial small. But the initial thickness was the same in the initial small and coarse. Just the mixture was a bit different, indeed.
Thank you.
So basically what we can conclude about this is that increasing the initial grain size, as we saw in the laboratory, we increase a lot the damage of fragmentation we observe. And we need more time in order to reach our steady state of porosity, because here you see that with these bigger grains, we still don't have a steady state porosity happening. So grain sizes and distribution changes the displacement to localized shearing, the boundary shear evolution, and activate also differently the central deformation zone that can have an impact on the way they can also go to unstable sliding after all. So then the last part of this work that I will not present you today since I'm still doing it is to be able to relate the acoustic emission that we observed in the laboratory with the kinetic energy we can extract from our discrete elements modeling. So basically, for each of the different zones, we can extract this kinetic energy, and the objective will be to relate it to the micromechanisms we observe to be able to understand better the acoustic emission and their amplitude we had in the laboratory. So take-home message number 3. We saw in the first part that grain-scale mechanical properties play an important role into shear localization mechanisms. So the friction between grains, the shear modulus, and the number of particles within the gouge can change in an important manner the localization mechanisms. We saw that models are able to replicate what is observed in the lab with the same physics if we put the good mechanisms within the models. And as for laboratory experiments, we show that larger grain size increases the damage. We show that fine grain size favor the slip localization. And which is also important, but I don't have time to focus on this today, is that the central deformation zone, we saw that is always activated, but in different ways. And for me, it clearly have a role on the way we could have or not instabilities in the late shearing experiments. Then I will be quick on this part since I don't have many things. But what about distributed deformation? So can we use modeling, numerical model, discrete elements to reproduce this type of mixtures? So I don't have it directly for now, but it exists old experiment, but not so old experiment of Guillaume Molon that mixed rigid grains with compliant grains, as you see here, that indeed, in a way, are really similar to this type of mixture of weak, strong minerals. So I just present you one slide of what he did. So basically, it increased the proportion of deformable grains within a strong mixture. So really similar to what I did in the laboratory. And by increasing the proportion of deformable grains, we decrease the steady state friction with deformable content. He also saw that strong grains concentrate the stresses, as you can see here on the strong grains, and facilitate microslips. While the weak grains, so the ones that are deformable, can trigger localized shearing here, for example, in shaft region. So I think this type of study can be a nice perspective to mix the technique with a fragmentation of strong grains and the weak content to better understand, for example, the heterogeneous grain mixtures. So this again, DM model can replicate what is observed in laboratory. So we saw it with grain fragmentation. We can still do a mixture between strong and weak minerals. And we are also implementing spring within the model to be able to go from a slow slip to stick slip with Guillaume Molon and Marco Scuderi. Just that depending on what you do, DM can be computationally costly. So this is a kind of the limitation. So to conclude about today's talk, I presented you some laboratory experiments with strong minerals, so mixing different strong minerals together to see the impact of grain scale and grain size for shear localization, focusing on acoustic emission. Then I put some weak mineral content into strong mineral for gouge in order to see the impact of this weak mineral for acoustic emission evolution and shear localization. Then I presented you some modeling, mainly on fragmentation to be able to observe shear localization within the faults. And we see that depending on the grain size, we have a different impact on the way the fault will be fragmented and on the way the different fault zone will impact the fault behavior. But the idea is really to connect the two techniques in order to understand granular mechanisms at the smaller scale and how they can lead to different type of shear localization. And then I let you with this video of a discrete element simulation we are doing now with Guillaume Molon, where we are able to reproduce wave propagation within this compliant medium, but still having our discrete element grains at the center of the fault. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Perfect timing, Nathalie. Really, what a fabulous talk. I'd like to invite people to unmute and join me in thanking Nathalie. Yeah, really a great talk and precisely on time. And while Nathalie is catching her breath just a minute, I can recommend that use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen and to put ourselves in some order to ask questions and be involved in a discussion. And there are many people here, so I would like to invite everyone to ask questions, participate in the discussion, ask points of clarification. And while you're all thinking about your first question, I'm going to ask a question because I have many. Beautiful talk, Nathalie, lots of interesting stuff. I wonder if you can say a little bit about what we might call the magnitude of completeness for your acoustic emission catalogs and your work on the interesting results as a function of different particle sizes. So for like the smallest particles, is part of the reason why you see fewer events and smaller event rates is it has to do with the inability to measure the tiniest AEs? Is that?
Yeah, but indeed, we